In this presentation, we'll examine some of the more common performance calculations for the Cessna 150M and highlight some of the important decision-making aspects involved. This module does not cover all of the performance charts and should not be considered a comprehensive lesson on the subject. It is assumed that the viewer has a basic working knowledge of aircraft performance theory. To provide a more practical lesson, we'll examine the Cessna 150 performance in the context of a proposed VFR cross-country flight from Palatka Municipal Airport, 28 Juliet, shown in the lower right, to Tallahassee International Airport, KTLH, in the upper left. The flight will initially proceed west across City Airport and then turn northwest toward Tallahassee as shown here. Here's a summary of the trip details that we will plan together in this video. The weight and balance was performed in the previous module, which you may want to view before continuing. This cross-country is a great initial flight for new pilots. A 2-hour trip through uncomplicated airspace will give you the opportunity to get to know your aircraft. Based on the weather and winds aloft, we have chosen a cruise altitude of 4,500 feet for the 153 nautical mile flight, which will consume about 10 gallons of fuel. Let's begin by taking a look at the takeoff distance chart. The Cessna 150 takeoff data is fairly simple. Beginning on the left side of the table, you'll note that only data for the maximum gross takeoff weight of 1,600 pounds is included. Pressure altitudes from sea level to 8,000 feet are shown. Both ground roll and distance to clear a 50-foot obstacle are included for the 5 outside air temperatures ranging from 0 to 40 degrees Celsius. As with any table or chart, always read and understand the conditions and notes. In this case, the takeoff data is based on the following conditions. Number 1, flaps retracted. Number 2, use of all available runway and full throttle application prior to brake release, as you would do for a typical short field. Number 3, a runway that is paved, has no slope or gradient, and is free of moisture contamination. And finally, calm winds. Also, note that the takeoff technique used was the maximum performance method outlined in the POH, which specifies a rotation speed of 53 knots and an initial climb at VX, or 60 knots. In addition to the takeoff performance technique, the notes recommend leaning the mixture for maximum RPM at density altitudes exceeding 5,000 feet. The effect of wind is addressed in note number 3, which decreases distances by 10% for each 9 knots of headwind and increases distances by 10% for each 2 knots of tailwind. While TimeBuildUSA does not permit operations from other than paved runways, Note 5 increases distances by 15% of the ground roll figure when operating on a dry grass runway. It is important for a pilot to know the headwind and crosswind component affecting takeoffs and landings. The headwind component is necessary for takeoff and landing distances, while the crosswind component is important for respecting aircraft, company, and personal limitations. For today's flight, we are planning to depart runway 35 at Palatka Airport. The winds are reported from 030 degrees at 6 knots. This yields a crosswind component of 4 knots and a headwind component of 4.5 knots. To use the takeoff distance table, determine the pressure altitude at the departure airport. Palatka Airport is 48 feet above mean sea level, and the current altimeter setting is 3006. This gives a computed pressure altitude of minus 92 feet. Entering the takeoff distance table at sea level, move across until you are in the column appropriate to the outside air temperature, which is 11 degrees Celsius for us today. Note the ground roll distance of 710 feet and the total distance to clear a 50-foot obstacle of 1,335 feet. The last step is to apply each of the adjustments from the notes to the data obtained from the table. For TimeBuildUSA operations, this will be note number 3 dealing with the effects of wind. For each 9 knots of headwind, the distances from the table should be decreased by 10%. As we computed a headwind component of 4.5 knots, then the ground roll and total to clear 50-foot obstacle distances should be reduced by 5%. Again, time-build USA aircraft are only to be operated from paved runways, and therefore note number 5 does not apply. Just as important as knowing what factors are included in performance data is knowing what is not included. These unaccounted for factors can significantly affect the actual aircraft performance and is a reason we always add a safety margin to the computed data. For the Cessna 150, the takeoff distance data does not include adjustments for runway contamination or runway slope, both of which can potentially increase takeoff distance. Also, such factors as pilot experience and proficiency, specifically in the aircraft type, and pilot technique can vary the results. Recall that Cessna's data required pilots to use a maximum performance method to obtain the results shown in the table. How often do we really do that? Also, consider that the aircraft and engine condition can introduce variations. Finally, errors made by the pilot in computing the takeoff distance are yet another possible source of differences between planned and actual performance. In light of all the factors that can affect takeoff and landing performance, and in order to help our pilots manage the risks, TimeBuild USA requires that pilots operate our aircraft from paved runways having at least 2,500 feet of available distance. It is recognized that operation at higher density altitudes increases takeoff and landing distance, and therefore an additional safety margin will need to be added to the 2,500 foot requirement under those circumstances. To make this easy for our pilots, we have created a modified version of the takeoff distance chart, which is included with the aircraft checklist. The chart has been color-coded to indicate density altitudes that will require longer runways. If the takeoff conditions are anywhere within the red boxed areas, then the minimum available runway distance is determined by multiplying the total to clear 50-foot obstacle distance applicable to the takeoff by 1.5. Let's take a look at how this simple calculation is performed. In this scenario, the pilot is contemplating using an airport that is 1,580 feet above mean sea level. It is a hot summer day with an air temperature of 30 degrees Celsius and altimeter setting of 29.70. The computed pressure altitude is 1,800 feet. The airport elevation, coupled with the high temperature and low pressure, should be a warning to the pilot that aircraft performance will be reduced. Looking at the takeoff distance chart, the variables would indeed place the operation in the red shaded area. To determine the minimum available runway that must be available to the pilot for both takeoff and landing at this airport, the total to clear 50-foot obstacle distance would be multiplied by 1.5, resulting in a required minimum runway length of 2,800 feet. In summary, at density altitudes less than 3,000 feet, the minimum available runway distance would be 2,500 feet. This corresponds with the green shaded area on the takeoff distance chart shown here. However, if the density altitude is 3,000 feet or higher, the pilot will need to determine the takeoff distance to clear a 50-foot obstacle for the existing conditions and then multiply that value by 1.5 to determine the minimum runway length required for both takeoff and landing. Density altitudes of 3,000 feet or more are indicated by red shading on the chart. There are many risks associated with takeoffs and climbs that need to be properly identified and managed by the pilot. This phase of flight accounts for about 1 in 6 accidents, the majority of which are fatal. Let's take a look at ways in which we can reduce the risk. After checking the weight and balance, perform takeoff and climb calculations using the manufacturer's POH. The effects of density altitude can drastically alter the aircraft's performance. Look carefully at charts for terrain and obstructions that could present a hazard. Be sure you are familiar with the surrounding airspace and any special procedures such as noise abatement. Identify your options in the event of a mechanical failure after takeoff that would necessitate an off-airport landing. Give careful consideration to the weather conditions. Respect your personal limitations, as well as those of the company and the airplane manufacturer. Winds are an important factor in takeoff performance and safety. Taking off with a tailwind, even a light one, can significantly increase takeoff distance. Strong crosswinds can result in loss of directional control. Always use the full available length of the runway for every takeoff. Avoid intersection takeoffs whenever possible. This will give you more options should you experience trouble during the initial climb. Before each takeoff, brief yourself on what you are about to do. Look at the wind indicator to determine the current winds. Review the emergency procedures in the event of an engine failure. Review the aborted takeoff procedure and remind yourself to abort if anything does not appear right. Identify threats to your departure, such as location of obstructions, terrain, airspace, and weather. Finally, review your initial course and altitude and ensure all navigation systems are set. Check engine instruments and RPM for proper indications early in the takeoff. Abort immediately if you suspect a problem and investigate further. For shorter runways, apply the 70-50 rule described in our takeoff module. In essence, if the aircraft has not achieved at least 70% of rotation speed by the midpoint of the runway, then abort. Always be prepared to reject a takeoff in the event something does not appear to be right. As the old saying goes, it is better to be on the ground wishing you were in the air than in the air wishing you were back safely on the ground. With the takeoff distance discussion complete, let's return to our cross-country flight planning and take a brief look at the climb chart for the Cessna 150. As its name implies, this chart provides the time in minutes, fuel in gallons, and distance in nautical miles to climb to a specified altitude from mean sea level. Let's begin as we always do with a careful review of the conditions and notes. The charted values assume flaps are retracted and full throttle is maintained throughout the climb. Additionally, standard temperatures apply. The notes direct us to add 10% for each 8 degrees Celsius above standard temperature. Also, the pilot should add 0.8 of a gallon of fuel for start, taxi, and takeoff to the fuel estimates shown in the chart. Finally, note that the effects of wind are not accounted for in the table. Recall that we will be departing from Palatka Municipal Airport, which is 48 feet above mean sea level, and climbing to 4,500 feet. Interpolating between the published values for 4,000 and 5,000 yields a time of 8 minutes, a distance of 9 nautical miles, and a fuel burn of 1.2 gallons. Remember that we need to add 0.8 of a gallon of fuel for start, taxi, and takeoff per note number 1, which results in a total fuel decline of 2 gallons. The winds aloft forecast shows a slight headwind for our westbound departure, which would reduce the distance to climb by a negligible amount. Likewise, the temperature is very close to standard, so no correction factor is necessary. For takeoffs from airports above mean sea level, simply determine the time, fuel, and distance to climb to the desired cruise altitude from sea level, as we did here. But then compute the time, fuel, and distance to climb from sea level to the airport elevation, and then deduct those values from the previous totals. The cruise performance table is one of the most important flight planning tools available to you. While it is a helpful planning aid, the table should also be used with actual outside air temperature once established in cruise. It is therefore included in the aircraft checklist for easier in-flight reference. The chart provides knots true airspeed and fuel burn rate in gallons per hour for various cruise altitudes at a given RPM. Notice that the chart contains data for 3 temperature columns, namely 20 degrees Celsius below standard, standard, and 20 degrees Celsius warmer than standard. Immediately underneath each pressure altitude, we have added the standard temperature. It is critical to understand that the fuel burn rates shown in this table are predicated on precise engine RPM setting and the use of the recommended leaning procedure per the notes. Any variation to either parameter will change the resultant speed and/or fuel burn. Let's return to our cross-country flight to see how the chart is used for planning. We will cruise at 4,500 feet, and while this is an indicated altitude, it would be close enough for use as a cruise pressure altitude. The forecast temperature for 4,500 feet is between 6 and 9 degrees Celsius, which is very close to standard temperature. Therefore, we will use the middle column of the chart. The chart depicts values for 4,000 and 6,000 feet, so we will need to interpolate for 4,500. Selecting a target RPM of 2,500 will produce about 60% horsepower, resulting in a true airspeed of 95 knots and a fuel burn rate of 4.5 gallons per hour. With the forecast winds aloft, we can now complete our flight planning for the trip. We previously computed our time, fuel, and distance to climb using the associated chart. Using your favorite flight planner and the winds aloft forecast, cruise values for the two legs of the trip can be completed based on a planned true airspeed of 95 knots and a fuel burn rate of 4.5 gallons per hour. During the 1 hour and 48-minute trip, the total fuel requirement would be 10 gallons. TimeBuildUSA requires pilots to always have 1 hour of reserve fuel available. To compute the planned reserve fuel, determine your landing fuel by subtracting the planned fuel burn total for the trip from the takeoff fuel. In our example, we departed Palatka with 20 gallons of fuel and planned to burn 10 gallons for the trip. This resulted in a planned landing fuel amount of 10 gallons, which, when divided by the crew's fuel burn rate of 4.5 gallons per hour, left a comfortable 2.2 hour reserve fuel supply. Leaning the engine properly is critical to obtaining planned fuel burn and preventing damage to the engine. On aircraft equipped with a single probe EGT, such as the one shown here, the leaning procedure is simplified once you understand its use. The gauge features a single needle that displays the exhaust gas temperature from a pre-selected cylinder. A scale is displayed in the background showing increments of 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with the distance between the large index marks representing 100 degrees. A movable reference pointer, shown here in yellow, can be adjusted by the pilot using the thumb screw at the bottom of the instrument. Once in cruise, as you begin to lean the mixture from an overly rich state, the exhaust gas temperatures will rise due to a more properly balanced fuel-air ratio. At some point, the EGT indication will reach a maximum deflection, or peak, after which continued leaning will result in a reversal and a cooling of EGT gases. Let's take a closer look at how to lean the engine using the EGT. We have just leveled off at our cruise altitude of 4,500 feet. The first step is to set cruise power to 2,500 RPM, which we determined to be about 60% horsepower using the cruise performance table previously. To begin the leaning process, move the reference pointer full left using the thumb screw. Begin to lean the mixture slowly so that the needle is able to follow. Watch carefully for the point at which the needle peaks or reaches maximum deflection. Mark the peak EGT with the reference pointer. Finally, begin enrichening the mixture until the EGT reads 125 to 150 degrees rich of peak value. This equates to between 5 and 6 divisions on the scale. Proper fuel management begins with a careful and accurate estimate of fuel burn using the POH tables we have discussed, along with all pertinent weather information. Before each flight, always check the fuel levels using the dipstick as described in the pre-flight module. Never rely on fuel gauges. Set the target cruise RPM precisely and lean the mixture using the recommended procedure. TimeBuildUSA aircraft have a portable electronic tachometer that can be used by the pilot for more accurate engine RPM setting in cruise. While en route, routinely compare the actual ground speed with the planned ground speed. Large differences indicate that your fuel calculations may be in error, which can affect your planned fuel reserve. If at any time you become uncertain about the fuel quantity or determine there is less than 1 hour reserve fuel remaining, find the nearest suitable airport with fuel services and land. At the end of each trip, when the aircraft is refueled, compare the actual fuel burned with what you had planned. Identify the reasons for any difference between the two. Finally, start with shorter legs and ample fuel reserves until you become comfortable with your aircraft and your planning techniques. Landing accidents account for roughly 40% of all accidents. Landing an aircraft safely not only requires skill and proficiency, but also sound aeronautical decision-making and judgment. Improper planning, unstabilized approaches, and weather conditions exceeding the pilot's or aircraft's limitations are common factors that reflect poor discipline. Every good approach in landing begins with proper planning. Like most aircraft, the Cessna 150 contains a landing distance chart shown here. There are many factors that are included, but there are many that are not. Let's take a minute and review the notes and conditions in the chart. The data included in the chart is predicated on a landing with 40 degrees of flaps. As discussed in the landing module, TimeBuildUSA only authorizes the use of 40 degrees of flaps when absolutely necessary or in an emergency such as an off-airport landing. The maximum flap extension is 30 degrees for normal operations. A power-off landing that uses maximum braking is also a condition of the landing data. The runway is assumed to be paved, dry, and level. Note 3 does make allowances for a dry grass runway, but remember that TimeBuildUSA aircraft must only be operated from paved runways. Wind conditions are calm, though Note 2 provides an adjustment for both headwinds and tailwinds. Distances should be decreased by 10% for each 9 knots of headwind and increased by 10% for each 2 knots of tailwind. Finally, the airspeed at 50 feet is 52 knots, which is significantly slower than the 60 knot approach speed used in normal operations with up to 30 degrees of flap. Okay, let's return to our cross country and compute the landing distance for arrival into Tallahassee, which has an airport elevation of 83 feet. You'll notice that the landing distance chart is very similar in design to the takeoff distance chart we reviewed earlier, and used much in the same way. The Tallahassee weather indicates a temperature of 13 degrees Celsius and altimeter setting of 3007, resulting in a pressure altitude of just 3 feet. The winds are 040 at 8 knots, so we can expect runway 36. This will give us a headwind component of 6 knots and a crosswind component of 5 knots. To determine the landing distance, enter the chart with the computed pressure altitude, which in our case is sea level. Move straight across to the column closest to the outside air temperature, which in our case is 10 degrees Celsius. Note the ground roll and total to clear 50-foot obstacle of 440 feet and 1,065 feet respectively. As with the takeoff distance table, the final step is to apply the adjustments from the applicable notes. Note 2 directs us to decrease distances by 10% for each 9 knots of headwind. Interpolating for our headwind component of 6 knots means we should decrease distances by 7%. The interpolation formula is shown at the bottom of this screen. Subtracting the headwind allowance results in a computed landing distance of 409 feet and a distance to clear a 50-foot obstacle of just under 1,000 feet. Just as we discussed with the takeoff distance chart, it is important to understand factors that will affect the actual landing distance, which are not adjusted for in the table. The final flap setting and approach speed have a significant impact on landing distance. Flying a faster than normal approach using a limited amount of flaps, such as on a gusty day, can dramatically increase landing distance. The runway itself can also increase landing distance. A runway contaminated with snow, ice, or rain, or one that is sloped downward are examples. Obstacles in the approach path that result in a higher than normal approach glide path may require additional runway. Of course, pilot skill and technique, just like with the takeoffs, also factor into the actual runway used, as does the aircraft condition, such as the condition of brakes. And just as with any computation, errors or reliance on inaccurate data, such as winds, can lead to erroneous results. The classic garbage in, garbage out situation. Let's review some risk mitigation strategies for the approach and landing phase that pertain to all of us in any airplane. First, make sure you are very familiar with your aircraft's capabilities. Use the landing distance chart to get an idea of what to expect under ideal conditions, and then add an adequate safety buffer above that. Even though TimeBuildUSA specifies a minimum runway requirement of 2,500 feet, your experience and proficiency coupled with the environment may necessitate a greater distance. Always respect any operating limitations specified by the manufacturer and your own personal limitations. Crosswind components are an excellent example. Until you gain familiarity with the aircraft and its handling characteristics, it would be wise to limit crosswind components to 5 knots. Flying a stabilized approach is one of the most important factors in a successful landing, in any aircraft. Too many accidents continue to happen when pilots try to save a faulty approach. Elements of a stabilized approach were covered previously in the landing module. Decisively executing a go-around if all stabilized approach criteria are not met by 200 feet AGL is a sign of disciplined airmanship. Be prepared to reject an approach or landing at any point, but remember that the earlier it is done, the safer the maneuver. This has been a presentation of TimeBuildUSA. TimeBuildUSA offers exceptionally clean late model Cessna 150 aircraft to pilots for extended rental periods. Now you can have access to your own aircraft for days or weeks at a time. Visit us online at TimeBuildUSA.com.